I saw a video recently of a fellow that was making a cutting board that he called a chaotic pattern. It was an ingrain board where he cut the wood square and then he cut the wood on an angle, and when he was finished it was a really neat looking cutting board that looked different than most ingrain boards that you might have seen or that you might have made yourself. Now this fellow was a professional woodworker and he had professional grade equipment and he was using some really nice lumber. I'm going to make a chaotic pattern cutting board using the tools that you see here in this room. And these are probably some of the same tools that you might have in your garage or that you might have in your basement. And I'm not going to use high-end lumber. I'm going to use the lumber that you can go to Lowe's or you can go to Home Depot and pick up for yourself. I'm calling this project the Poor Man's Chaotic Pattern Cutting Board. Now let's get started on it and we'll see how she turns out. We're going to be using some poplar 1x2 stock today, and I like to use poplar in these cutting boards because it gives you a nice variation of color and a nice variation of grain pattern. I've made several out of poplar. Some of them are 5 or 6 years old and all the glue joints are still holding tight and the boards haven't warped. So I'm going to keep using poplar if I can until it shows me that it can't hold up in a cutting board. But it's readily available at Lowe's and Home Depot, so it's pretty easy for most of us to pick up. But I like the color variation that you get with poplar, everything from a green to a blonde to a brown. And you get a nice grain variation as well, particularly when you're doing an in-grain cutting board. That's what you want to look for, because when you turn it up on the ends, you'll be able to see all these color variations from the end, and it makes a pretty neat look. Now we're going to be doing the chaotic pattern today that I saw another YouTuber do, and as I mentioned before, he's got really expensive equipment and he uses nicer wood than poplar, but I thought I'd try to make one that just anybody can make and see how it turns out, sort of an everyman's chaotic pattern on the cutting board. First thing we got to do is plane down these sides to get them nice and smooth and flat, and then we'll glue it up. Now that we've got the stock planed up and ready to get glued together, you want to take a quick check of each board and look on this face edge and make sure you don't have any dings or divots in it, because that's the face that's going to be up against the other board and we're going to glue them together. Now when we make our cut to make it an in-grain board, you're going to cut it here and then turn that up on the edge. And if you've got a big divot right there and it ends up being on the face of the cutting board, it's going to take a lot of sanding to get that out. So go ahead now and check all your boards and make sure you don't have any divots or dings on them on this face edge that's going to be glued together. In order for this to fit through the planer, I've got to do them in two separate pieces because I've got a 12-inch planer and this is about 13.5 inches wide both together. So I'll do two narrow pieces and then glue those two pieces together and put them on the drum sander. But initially, two short ones. Underneath, I put painter's tape down to keep the glue off my clamps. I'm going to take and join these two pieces together to make our final size, and I think I'm going to add one more to it because it was just a little bit narrow. So I'm going to add one more piece to it, make it a little better than 13 inches, 13.5 inches across. We'll glue that up and then we'll start our cross cuts on it. Got it cut up. Now we're going to flip the pieces to get the end grain up. And you'll see pretty quickly why I like to work with poplar so much on these cutting boards. You can see we've flipped the pattern and rolled it over as well. So now what was V's have become X's down the middle. And then you've got your varying grain on each side. And normally I'd leave that board just like that, glue it up, sand it down, and finish it off. But since we're doing that chaotic pattern, got a few more cuts to make. So I'm going to glue it up, and then we'll cut it up again. Alright, that's how it looks after the glue up. We're going to run it through the drum sander. Get these sides a little bit flat just to get that glue residue off. And then we'll slice it and dice it one more time. Got it clamped up one more time. I think I've got to make one more cut on it to stay true to the particular form that I'm doing on this one, the design that I'm doing on this one. I like the way it looked yesterday, and now that we've cut it again, that spatial dimension I had has all gone away, so I can't go back to that, so we'll just keep cutting it. It gets smaller every day. It lost about 2 inches all the way around today, so now I'm down to 12 inches by 13 inches, and when I cut it tomorrow, I'll lose about 2 more on it, because we're cutting on a diagonal, and so you lose a lot of wood that way. So we'll see how it turns out. I believe I've got to make one more cut on it for this particular design, and then we should be through with it after tomorrow as far as cutting and gluing up goes. So we'll let it set overnight, and we'll see how it looks tomorrow. This board is all sanded up and ready for the first coat of oil, and I like to use this butcher block. This particular can is probably a year and a half old, so I stirred it up really good and strained it into here so I'd have clean oil to work with. And I just take a piece of a sheet, cut it up, have at it. Now this oil does have a little bit of an amber quality to it. That's just the nature of the oil. And this board is going to turn a little brownish as it ages anyway. It's not going to stay green like it is now. It'll brown out a little bit. But I'm going to finish this up and hang it up to dry. So I've got 2 coats of finish on here already, and I've sanded between each coat with 400 grit sandpaper. And I sand pretty aggressively between these because this particular oil that I'm using, this butcher block oil, actually has a finish quality to it. And I don't want the oil that I put on here to build up. I want it to seep into and saturate the wood grain. So I aggressively sand it between each coat, and I'll end up probably putting about 6 coats or better on this particular board and sanding with 400 and then 600 grit paper in between each time. And I mentioned earlier that this finish is about a year and a half old, so it's starting to thicken up a little bit. So I'm going to add some mineral spirits to it to thin it out, and that'll help it saturate into the grain even better. So again, I aggressively sand between each coat because I want to do a really light coat each time so it can saturate instead of building up. And here's a tip for you: when you fold your sandpaper, help it make it last a little bit longer. A lot of times guys will fold the sandpaper and just fold it like this and not even be aware that you've got grit rubbing against grit. That'll actually wear down your sandpaper a lot quicker. So to make your sandpaper last a little bit longer, go ahead and fold it in quarters and then tear one all the way to the center. And then fold it this way, fold it over, and fold it again. And that way you've got paper backing against grit on all sides. You don't have anywhere where you've got grit rubbing against grit, and your paper will last about 4 times as long. But I've got several more coats I'm going to put on this. I'll go ahead and get to it, and we'll see how it looks when it's all done. Here's our finished product on our chaotic pattern cutting board, and you might remember that our challenge to ourselves was to make a chaotic pattern that would be similar to the pattern that I've seen professionals make when they use professional grade lumber and professional grade tools. Now this is just poplar that I picked up at Lowe's, and I used the same type of tools that you've probably got in your home woodworking shop. Not too tough to make. If you want to make one of these chaotic patterns, you need to keep in mind that you're going to lose a lot of real estate on this cutting board, because when you make those diagonal cuts, it eats up a lot of lumber. So you've got to start out big and you'll end up small. But it's a lot of fun to make, and it's a really interesting pattern, something else to challenge yourself with: the chaotic pattern cutting board. I believe you can make one in your woodworking shop, and I think it's going to turn out really nice.